They still mention him sometimes, not directly and not with any particular intention or weight behind it, just in passing, the way people reference a memory that never quite felt significant enough to examine closely. They remember the way he used to carry himself in those earlier days, too eager in the way he engaged with people, too open with the parts of himself that probably should have been protected, too available to anyone who wanted access to his time and his attention and his energy. They remember how he used to explain himself when questioned, how he would work carefully to make his reasoning legible to people who were never genuinely curious about understanding it. They remember the version of him that needed to be understood, that reached toward connection even when the connection being offered back was thin and conditional and not worth what it was costing him to maintain. And sometimes in those casual passing conversations they laugh, not cruelly, not with any conscious awareness of what they are doing. Just the easy, unexamined laughter of people who believe they still know someone because they once knew an earlier version of them. What they have not yet understood is that the person they are laughing about has not existed for a long time. They are describing someone who is already gone. There was no single moment where everything shifted and the transformation became visible and undeniable. No announcement he made to the people around him, no dramatic event that anyone could point to afterward as the clear dividing line between who he had been and who he was in the process of becoming. It happened the way most real and lasting change actually happens when you look at it honestly, quietly, incrementally, in the unglamorous accumulation of ordinary days that did not feel significant while they were being lived through, in the repetitive mornings that asked nothing dramatic of him, but built something in him through their consistency alone. In the small and private choices that no one was present to witness or validate or even register as choices worth making. In the moments of friction and disappointment and invisible effort that left deposits of something harder and more certain in him each time he moved through them without retreating. He stopped reacting to things the way he always had before. The triggers that used to produce immediate and predictable responses began to lose their hold on him one by one. He stopped thinking along the same familiar grooves that had always directed his attention and his energy toward the approval and understanding of people who were never going to give him either in any form that would last. He stopped needing the things he had spent years organizing his behavior around trying to secure. None of it happened all at once or on any schedule he had consciously set for himself. But it happened consistently enough and thoroughly enough that at a certain point it became something that could not be reversed even if he had wanted to reverse it, which he did not. At some point along the way, the texture of his familiar world began to feel different beneath his hands. The conversations that had once felt like genuine connection began landing differently, leaving less behind when they ended than they used to. The environments he had always moved through without friction began to feel smaller than his current understanding of things, like rooms he had grown too large to stand upright in without noticing the ceiling pressing down. The energy of the spaces and relationships that had once felt like home began to carry a particular kind of familiarity that he recognized as something he had already moved past rather than something he was still moving toward. He did not sit down and make a calculated decision to create distance between himself and the life he had been living. He did not construct an exit or engineer a separation or announce to anyone that something was ending. He simply stopped fitting into the shape of things as they had always been arranged around him, and distance, when it is rooted in genuine growth rather than manufactured for effect, does not require any forcing. It creates itself naturally and without drama from the simple fact of a person no longer belonging to the version of their life they once occupied completely. The gap opened not because he pushed anyone away, but because he kept moving forward while the familiar stayed exactly where it had always been. They began to register something different about him gradually, and without being able to name precisely what had changed or when the change had taken hold. It was not communicated through anything he said directly or any explicit signal he offered to the people paying attention. It came through an absence more than presence, in what was no longer there rather than in anything new that had been visibly added. He did not react to things the way they had come to expect him to react. The buttons that had previously produced reliable and immediate responses no longer seemed to connect to anything when pressed. He did not engage in the familiar dynamics that had always defined how he related to the people and environments around him. He did not try to prove anything to anyone, did not reach for validation, did not adjust his behavior in response to the subtle social pressures that had once shaped so much of how he moved through rooms and conversations. What they found in place of all of that was a stillness, a quality of settled and unforced calm that had not been present in him before, and that none of them had a ready framework for understanding or categorizing. And the people who had once looked past him without a second thought, who had found it easy and costless to overlook him in rooms full of people competing for attention, began to pay closer attention to him without being entirely sure why the attention was being drawn there. Something had changed in him in a way that was impossible to articulate, but equally impossible to ignore once you were close enough to feel it. Not loudly, without announcement or performance or any apparent desire to be noticed, but completely in a way that left nothing of the previous version intact for anyone still looking for it. By the time the people around him had gathered enough observations to confirm that something fundamental and irreversible had shifted, the transformation was already long finished. There was no in-between stage left to witness, no transitional version of him still available for inspection or commentary, or the kind of casual analysis that people apply to someone they believe they have already figured out. The version of him they had laughed about in those passing conversations, the eager and available and endlessly explaining version that had handed his certainty over to anyone willing to temporarily hold it, that version had been replaced a long time ago. And the person standing in his place now operated from an entirely different set of internal coordinates. He did not feel the pull to return to the familiar simply because it was familiar, and returning to it would have resolved the distance in a way that made other people more comfortable. He did not feel any need to offer clarification about who he had become to people who had formed their understanding of him in an earlier chapter they had mistaken for the whole story. He did not feel compelled to rebuild the connections that had quietly dissolved during the years of invisible transformation simply because their absence had finally become noticeable to the people who had never fully valued their presence. Because there are certain kinds of transformation that do not leave a door open for returning to what came before them, not out of bitterness or the desire to make anyone feel the weight of what they missed, but simply because the person doing the returning no longer exists in the form that would have made the return feel like going home rather than going backward. They are still laughing sometimes, still referencing the version of him that felt easy and familiar and available for that particular kind of casual dismissal. Still telling the story of someone they believed they understood completely because they had seen an early draft and mistaken it for the finished thing. And the strangest part of all of it, the part that carries the most quiet weight when you sit with it honestly, is that every laugh, every passing reference, every confident assessment they are still making about who he is and what he is capable of, all of it is aimed at someone who is no longer there to receive it. They are laughing at a person who no longer exists, and the person who replaced him has long since stopped listening for the sound of it.